People, I find, tend to exert their independence. We like to exert our independence. It shows up at every stage of life. Teenage independence stories abound, always trying to set themselves apart from their parents, apart from their culture, their rules, and any other shackles that teenagers feel that they want to throw off at any given moment. My teenage years were spent in the 1980s. Teenage rebellion then looked like mullet haircuts. Who knows what a mullet haircut is? Yeah, okay. So that's really short on top and then long in the back. It looked like the emergence of music that our parents did not like. Madonna, Michael Jackson, Metallica, things like that. Kids would listen to it. Their parents didn't like it. One phenomenon which arose back then in the 80s was punk rock. Teens wore black leather pants. They dyed their hair in various colors and all spiked way up in every direction. Ears not just pierced, but chained with piercings that went from their ear dangling all the way across their cheek and being pierced in their nose. They wore this chain of piercings. Both boys and girls of these punk rock teens, they wore black eyeliner with white foundation makeup on their faces. It was a way for them to express their individuality and independence. With their appearance, they daily asserted, I am my own person and I do not need to conform to society's expectations. The irony I always found was that these punk rockers all expressed their individuality in the same way. They all got together in that one corner of the cafeteria and you could hardly tell them apart from one another. As an expression of personal independence, they did so in an ultimately conformist manner. But every generation has its teenagers wrestling with self-identity in one manner or other. But it's not only teens who have an independent streak. Last weekend, my dad and we went to the gun show at the arena in Havelock, just east of town here. Yeah, they had a gun show in the arena. Anyway, my dad's uncle was there, and he was helping out with the gun show. And so we went for coffee with him. And in conversation, he said that since he turned 80, they make him do a test before he can renew his driver's license. Every 2 years, he has to do this. They don't do that out in Western Canada where I just moved from, so I was asking him about it. And he said that the entire testing center had others there taking the test at the same time he did, and nobody there taking the test liked it. The test was not only too simplistic, they argued, but they didn't like the thought of possibly losing their license over it. A small, silly test having huge implications on their independence. Lisa's grandma years ago got to the point where she could not live on her own in her home anymore. She would do dangerous things without realizing it, like leave the stove on. She needed assistance and supervised care. But she never did seem to quite like living in the care home that she moved into. So Lisa and I visited her one time, probably about a year or more into her move. And when we were leaving, she asked if she could come with us. She was ready to pack her bags. We said, no, Grandma, we're not allowed to take you with us. And then she said, well, then you tell Gord to come and get me as soon as he can, because this place is nice and all, but you sure wouldn't want to live here. It's an awful thing to watch your independence fall through your fingers and slip away. We don't want to let go of it when we're older. We relish it when we're teens, and we chase after it even as infants. All three of my kids got to the point when they would no longer allow Mommy and Daddy to put the spoonful of mashed carrots into their mouth. Each of them very quickly got to the stage of reaching for that spoon so they could do it themselves. You ever seen an infant feed themselves before? They make a mess. Food got everywhere, not just in their face and their hair either. At bedtime, I'd find sweet potato that had snuck its way past the bib, underneath the jumper, and smeared onto the chest. How does that even happen? What a mess is made by human independence. Independence is explored by the infant, indulged in by the teenager, and grasped as tightly as it can be by the elderly. We want independence at every stage of our life. And that very human desire spills over into our relationship with God. And I'm going to reread that passage which Cindy read for us earlier. If you want to turn to it, you may. If you want to just listen, that's fine as well. It's in 1 Samuel chapter 8. So it's back in the Old Testament. So this was long ago. And it's verse 8, chapter 8, verse 19 to 22. 1 Samuel 8, 19 to 22. Here's how it starts. But the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel. And they said, "No, but there shall be a king over us, that we may also be like all the other nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles." And when Samuel had heard all the words of the people, he repeated them in the ears of the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, "Obey their voice and give them a king." Samuel then said to the men of Israel, "Then go, every nation to his own city," or every man to his own city. This is a hugely significant piece of world history buried in the pages of the Bible in 1 Samuel. The people of God call for a king to represent them before other nations. Now, at this point in history, how have God's people been led? It's always been by some kind of spokesperson. God can directly speak to people when he wants, and it was his pattern to use individuals as a liaison between himself and a group. He spoke to Adam and Eve when they walked in the Garden of Eden together. He spoke to Noah and told him to build an ark. He spoke to Abraham and told him to go to a new land with his family. He spoke to Gideon and told him to take courage in the face of danger. He spoke to Samuel and told him to select a king for the people of Israel. But a king for Israel was not God's plan. God had used other people, prophets and judges, spokespersons whom he had chosen. But now the idea of a king came from a place of jealousy and keeping up with the Joneses. They wanted a king to represent them to other nations, because kings are the face of a nation. They are dressed in splendor to show off wealth. They are followed by an entourage of assistants to project knowledge and wisdom. They are poised and confident, projecting strength in their demeanor and posture, saying in not so many words, "If you deal with us, you best be careful not to cross us, lest the full power of our nation crush you." Instead of these holy men and women of humble manner and low estate which God had chosen as leaders, the people wanted their own kind of leader. "There shall be a king over us, that we also might be like all the other nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles." They wanted someone who would speak his mind, represent their interests, intimidate enemies, and lead with such passion and zeal and conviction that it compels people to follow with great loyalty. Such a leader, such a king would deliver us into all our hopes and plans for a brighter future, they thought. They wanted it their way. The problem is when we want it our way, God's plan becomes no longer plan A, but rather a fairly distant plan B. And we allow ourselves to begin to argue with God. And we allow ourselves to debate God. And we allow ourselves to think we know better than God. And we convince ourselves that God's laws and God's ways and God's commands are not necessarily the best way, but are mere suggestions in a sea of valid ideas. And there is when we get into trouble. With the Old Testament story of the kings, the downside is not immediately apparent. King Saul starts off not too bad, and King David becomes a known hero of the Old Testament. Even King Solomon is famous in secular circles because of his great wisdom. But when you look at the whole of the Old Testament and the stories of the generations of the kings, it paints a very bleak picture. Where the people wanted strength in leadership, they got weakness. Where they wanted courage, they got fear. Where they wanted stewardship, they got self-indulgence. And when they wanted justice, they got none. Over the course of this fall coming up, our sermon series will follow the story of the kings of Israel and how did it go when people put their own plan before God's plan. As a pastor, I've spoken with people whose marriages are a shambles and they are on the brink of divorce. I've spoken to people who have gotten wrapped up in immorality of various kinds. I've spoken to people who fight depression or guilt or shame. I've consulted people who are in financial ruin. And almost every time their troubles stem back to a point where they were disobedient to God's commands in some way or another. Now, I'm not suggesting that your obedience to God's commands will guarantee you a smooth and easy life. That doesn't always happen. And I realize, of course, that God always has the option of redeeming someone out of the trouble they've gotten themselves into, no matter how dire the situation. Redemption is always an option for God. I believe that very strongly. But there's a lot of personal and relational ruin that could be avoided if only people would obey God instead of debate against Him. Think about the command to be generous. The Old Testament says to be hospitable and kind to the stranger. The New Testament says to take care of the poor and the thirsty and the hungry and naked. From the beginning to the end of the Bible, it is consistent on this theme of generosity. And what do you suppose is our typical gut response to an opportunity to be generous? We talk ourselves out of it. Well, yeah, that'd be a good idea, but I just can't afford it. Or maybe, but just not right now. I sure wish I could help out there. We basically tell God His idea isn't quite as good as ours. He doesn't have all the information. If only God knew my situation, He wouldn't ask me to be generous. And so it comes down to an issue of trust. Do we trust God even when His commands are difficult? Do we trust Him to steer us right? Can you trust Him more than you trust yourself? Turning the other cheek is another one of those hard commands of the Bible. We want to protect ourselves, not become a victim all over again, and so we will debate with God. It's not a good idea to turn the other cheek. Not in this instance, God. You don't know all the facts, so I'm not going to do it. There's a command to do mercy. Well, sometimes I don't think the person deserves mercy. They made their bed so they can lie in it. Conventional wisdom sits directly opposed to God's command. The people of Samuel's day in the Old Testament had a chance to follow the person who spoke directly with God. They could have trusted God's care. They could have trusted God's plans. They could have trusted God's commands. But instead, they exerted their independence. They declared, "We have our feet on the ground. We know what's best." Other nations, they respect strength, and they respect wealth, and they respect power. So that's the kind of image we need to project. But God, your prophets and your judges, they don't look like that. They're too humble and they're too lowly. So we want a king because that's a better idea. God wanted his people to humbly serve the world, but his people wanted to be just like everybody else. We would do well today to think long and hard before we debate God's commands in our lives, but that seems to be a favorite pastime in Canada. Tearing people down from ivory towers and second-guessing those in authority. We do that all the time. We hold up Olympic athletes as heroes because they play a sport, but then we tear down our politicians who spend their time trying to figure out the best course of legislation in a complex world. We don't take our doctor's word for it anymore. We Google our symptoms on the internet, figuring that we'll know better. We don't trust an investor. Rather, we do our own research and figure out our own investment vehicles as though our pastime hobby can tell us everything we know about the world of global finance. And what we've done is we've taken our skepticism of leadership in our culture and we've projected it onto God. And we've given ourselves permission to doubt him and second guess him and debate the very validity of his commands. We wonder at his scriptures and we challenge his very existence. And God, in his patience, allows us the freedom to go this way. But he has warned us in advance. There are consequences if you go down that road. And instead of skepticism, he invites us to trust. Instead of doubt, he invites us to belief. Instead of holding him at arm's length, he invites us to love him as he first loved us. If you want to exercise your independence, then don't stand with the world against God. Rather, be independent of the world and stand with God. Amen.